Let's broaden that conversation and some of the things we're watching today, the financial aid package, a deal with the United States on a closing of the border to tourists and visitors from both countries. Let's bring in Brian Kingston. He's the Vice President of Fiscal and International Policy at the Business Council of Canada. Hello, Brian Kingston. Good to speak with you again.
Morning. How are you?
Good. Anticipating at some point the Prime Minister's announcement. A couple of things to talk to you about. Let's start. Business leaders in this country in the last few days have sort of issued a challenge to each other and to the nation to just have a single-minded focus here on trying to stop the spread of this disease in its tracks. Let's start with your expectations for the Prime Minister's announcement on economic measures. What do you want to see?
Well, of course, we're witnessing widespread and significant impacts on the Canadian economy. This initially was, mostly affecting sectors like aviation, transportation, tourism, hospitality. But now that measures have broadened out, this is impacting, virtually every sector of the economy. So we're looking for a broad-based package to help companies weather this storm. And our main ask is we're hoping to see support for employers to allow employees to remain on the payroll as we navigate this very difficult period, as opposed to pushing them into the EI system, which could overwhelm that and frankly may not be as beneficial to the employees.
All right. We just heard from Dan Kelly from the Federation of Independent Business, his suggestion. Look, if the government could find a way to pick up 75% of the paycheck during this crisis for employees, and the business would handle the other 25%. In that same camp?
Exactly, in that same camp. Yeah, we've been watching how other countries have responded to this, including Germany and Denmark. And that's the method that they're using. They're implementing policies that allow the government to give direct grants to companies to help them cover payroll costs over the coming weeks.
Okay. What are you expecting to see as this moves forward? There's a certain amount of urgency around these measures, and so getting action quickly is important. Even if the government takes these measures, what are you watching for as this effect on business moves forward? Even if the government comes forward with money to help support employees on the payroll.
Well, what we're hoping to see is some medium to long-term thinking about how we actually come out of this. And I know in the midst of a crisis, it can be hard to think about that, but we know that we will see the other side of this. We will contain the virus. And then what we need to see is a very aggressive recovery from the downturn. So we're hoping that some thoughts going into how we do that. We'd like to see efforts to encourage corporate investment in machinery and equipment and R&D, and ultimately help the Canadian economy spring back to life. So that's what we're asking for, and we have some ideas in how that could be done.
Let's talk a little bit about the border, Brian Kingston. These measures today, any concerns about what the government and the United States are likely to announce, shutting it down to visitors and tourists?
Yeah, of course, look, the Canada-US border is absolutely critical to the Canadian economy. It goes without saying, 75% of our exports go into the US. Not only that, we depend on many critical imports from the US, including medical supplies and food. So we're encouraged, of course, that this is going to focus on non-essential travel. However, we know from the experience with 9/11, when there was border closures, it did have an impact on business and trade, and aggregate trade fell as a result. So this has to be done very carefully. The definition of non-essential travel, the devil's in the details there. There are many specialists, both Canadian and US company specialists, who cross the border literally every single day to do everything from servicing equipment in the energy sector to medical device operations. So we need to make sure that that definition of non-essential is very clear and doesn't have unintended consequences for critical sectors during this period.
Yeah, do you think there's an easy way to manage that? Is there an easy way to ensure, without, one has, and I don't want to be, I don't want to make this too complicated, but one, I suppose, has the image of trucks backed up at the border to determine, who's essential and who isn't. Is there an easy way to make this process work?
Unfortunately, there's probably not an easy way to do it, but the absolute first step must be very close coordination with the business sector to make sure that companies can flag to government the employees and the people that they have crossing the border every single day that are essential to keeping that business running and keeping those goods moving. So compiling that list, making sure that there's flexibility in these regulations, because the last thing we want is, what you've indicated, the potential for a 15-hour lineup at the Ambassador Bridge, which is exactly what we saw during 9/11. And the important thing to remember here is that a lot of Canadian companies, particularly in the manufacturing sector, they depend on just-in-time delivery. Their whole system is set up that way so that a product needs to be arriving within a 2-hour window to make the supply chain. So you can't have a scenario where you have long-term border backups. The same goes for the food sector, where of course perishables need to move quickly. So this is going to involve very close cooperation with government over the next few days.
On the broader statement that we heard from the Business Council and other companies earlier this week here in Canada, what's the message companies are sending out to each other and to Canadians about the need to try and stop as much as we can, to try and stop the spread of this virus?
Yeah, the Canadian business community has come together in a unified voice to urge each other and the government to adopt a coordinated approach to containing this virus. So a number of our companies have taken really aggressive measures, including, of course, across the board work from home policies, the elimination of all travel. So we're calling for coordination first and foremost, both amongst our businesses, but also across government, because there is some level of confusion, particularly if you're a large company and you have operations across Canada. In different jurisdictions, you're seeing different rules. How many people are allowed to gather? Are we having a state of emergency in this province and not another province? So there's a need for the federal government to be very coordinated and clear in its messaging, because that will help businesses take the very necessary and aggressive actions to contain this and ensure that their employees are protected.
Some of the companies that the Business Council of Canada represents are in the distribution business and moving product across the country and so on. Lots of Canadians concerned about supply chain issues and so on. What do we need to know?
Yeah, so I mean, just to give you an example, a truck driver that's moving back and forth across the border, a long haul truck driver, how do we treat that if suddenly they think that they have symptoms? How do we ensure that they're getting tested quickly enough so that if they do have COVID, they can be immediately replaced? So there are some processes that need to be put in place to make sure that those critical transportation functions can operate while at the same time protecting the health of Canadians and Americans.
And what about the supply chain in this country? Lots of Canadians worry about product moving across the country and lots of concerns about that. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, there have been lots of concerns with supply chains. That's been particularly exacerbated, of course, by some of the demand that we've seen at grocery stores. But very reassuring messages have been coming out from Canada's corporate leaders in those sectors, including Loblaws. The supply chain is working. It remains effective, and they are addressing shortages, and everything will be stocked once the initial panic that we saw starts to subside. So the supply chain is absolutely working. I'm not concerned about that. Where I do get concerned, though, is, to my previous point, depending on how broad this Canada-US border non-essential travel rule is, there is a risk that you start to see backups at the border that could have an impact on the Canadian supply chain. So it's something we have to watch very closely.
All right, Brian Kingston, Vice President, the Business Council of Canada. Thanks for your input today as we stand by to hear from the Prime Minister. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.